Thank you very much, and thank you so much for taking the time to join us today for what will be an excellent webinar. My name is Vincent Power, and I have the honour of being the current chairman of the European Maritime Law Organisation. And my tasks today are very simple, very few, but very important. First of all, to welcome you. To thank you for taking time from no doubt busy schedules to join us for this seminar and tomorrow's seminar. They both promise to be excellent. Secondly, I want to give you a little bit of background about EMLO. EMLO, the European Maritime Law Organization, is the leading organization of its type in the world. We hold a variety of events, some of which are only open to members. So it's important to join. And for example, this year, we have embraced the sad challenge of COVID. We've had perhaps more events this year than we've had in any other year. We had an excellent event at the beginning of the year where we looked back at developments in European maritime law over 2020. We had a very incisive event when we looked at, for example, COVID and how it's impacted on the shipping sector and seafarers. And we had speakers drawn from around the world on that webinar. And then we had a really interesting webinar on how the Biden administration will impact on maritime matters. And later on this year, we have webinars on trade, competition, whistleblowing, national security, and so on. So take the time to do two things. One, to look at our website, www.emlo.org, and look at events. And secondly, and more importantly, join EMLO. If you join EMLO and participate, you too could be giving this webinar in a short while. So we really do want you to join and take a very active and full part in this great organization. Other things I need to do before handing over to the chairman for today's event are to really to thank Sarah Murray of EMLO, who has been fantastic and instrumental in herding everybody together to prepare for this event, and to thank Marlene Borjason from Gorison Federspiel in Copenhagen, who has done wonderful work in coordinating the technology for all of this, and to thank Gorison Federspiel for all of their work in that regard. I'd also like to thank, and it's really important that we'd like to thank RBB. RBB have very kindly sponsored this webinar, and RBB, as you know, are a leading firm of economists. The best thing is always have RBB on your side if you need economists, particularly in competition economics, but other areas as well, particularly in environmental matters as well. And there's only one thing worse, and that's finding that RBB is on the other side. So do have a look at their website, and we really do thank them for the great sponsorship today. I'm not going to introduce our great speakers. That will be the task of Sir Nicholas. And I'm just going to introduce Sir Nicholas. Now, obviously, he needs no introduction, but as always happens, I will still introduce him, just in case you've been in lockdown for a very long time and you haven't heard of his great work. So Nicholas was called to the bar in 1970. He was extraordinarily innovative. He moved to Brussels in 1979 to set up a new chamber of barristers specializing in European Economic Community competition law and European economic law at that time, European Union law now. He practiced extensively over 20 years before the courts in Luxembourg and elsewhere. He became an Irish barrister in 1981, Queen's Counsel in 1987, and so on. But he then spent 16 years as a judge of the General Court in Luxembourg. And that means that he was involved in something like 1,500 cases. He was juge rapporteur in 464 of them. And just reviewing those cases, Air Tours, Tetra Laval, Schneider, GE Honeywell, Microsoft, CADA, FIFA, UEFA, and so on. If you should ever be on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire and you need to phone a friend about the state of EU law, then Sir Nicholas is the man to phone. In the meantime, if you're not a contestant on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire and you need to get good legal advice, he is in White and Case in Brussels. But he will forget more than the rest of us will ever learn about many aspects of this area. So, ladies and gentlemen, may I hand over to Sir Nicholas, who's going to lead today's webinar. And thank you for all of your participation.
Well, Vincent, thank you for that introduction. I hadn't realized that I was going to be on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, but I will try and do my best by saying that rather than the knowledge that I've accrued over some 16 odd years at the court, we're going this afternoon to put you into the hands of two of the leading experts in what this first part of our sustainability seminar is about. So thank you all in the audience for joining this event. We brought together, I think, two of the leading experts who will be talking in our first session, which should last until about, for about an hour from now, about the steps that the shipping industry is going to have to take in the immediate and medium-term future if it's to get anywhere near responding to some of the targets that are being increasingly set at the moment. The shipping industry, as I'm sure you know, is already responsible for about 2.5% of total global carbon dioxide emissions. If these are to go down as they need to, there are going to have to be changes, and it's clear that legal frameworks are going to be part of the ways in which authorities around the world are aiming to push the industry, insofar as it needs pushing, into responding to that challenge. We're waiting, of course, as many of you will know, for the European Commission's Fit for 55 proposals, which are part of its Green Deal package. And these are expected, of course, to have a profound impact on the shipping industry in Europe and, of course, worldwide. Now, our two speakers are James Corbett, who is the Environmental Director Europe for the World Shipping Council. He will be speaking first. And then from someone outside but very close to the industry, Jacob Armstrong, who is the Sustainable Shipping Officer at Transport and Environment, a well-known and, if I may say so, very sensible contributor to some of the challenges that the industry faces. So without more, I'm now going to hand you straight over to James Corbett, who has a number of slides, which I hope you'll all be able to see on your screens. The one thing that I would say is this is going to be quite a concentrated session. There is the possibility for you to put questions, but the best way to put them is by sending them to @emlo.org. And then if there is time for them, the people at EMLO will put those together and hopefully we'll be able to deal with them at the end of the session. So thank you. Now over to you, James Corbett.
Thank you very, very much. I'm going to hit share my slides, which I think may bump the slides that are being shared now, but that will prepare for the very few slides that I have here to share. And just a quick thumbs up, Sir Nicholas, do you see the slides? Very good.
I see them, thank you.
All right, first of all, thank you very, very much for the opportunity to participate on this panel with Jacob Armstrong and on behalf of EMLO. This is a terrific opportunity, and I'm really welcoming the discussion. I've prepared a very short deck of slides in response to request that there be some context for the shipping discussion today. This first slide has on the x-axis time out to 2050, and it's an index of 3 different metrics. It's an index of world GDP in black, an index of world seaborne trade in gray, and in red, CO2 emissions from shipping as reported by the 4 IMO greenhouse gas studies. And the studies have suggested that there be projections out to 2050 from which our targets have been committed to. And what you see in the top dashed line is the 3rd GHG mid-growth target. And what you see importantly in the 4th GHG study is the mid-growth target from the 2020 report to IMO. And what's important to recognize is that the industry and the IMO and the international policy community have set targets for 2030 and for 2050 relative to a 2008 shipping GHG reference year. And so there's a substantial path forward for decarbonization. It's important to note that, the World Shipping Council is committed not only to these targets, but to zero carbon as soon as possible. And we're looking to meet or beat these targets if we can. Just to put some context in this, this is a global overlay graph of really the three major freight sectors. They move about 99.9% of all freight goods in the world. And you see road and you see rail and you see shipping. And if we were to compare the freight sector with the passenger vehicle sector on a global basis using International Energy Agency data, you can see that the freight sector is roughly equal, a little less than the passenger road vehicles. And what we're talking about today is the commitments by shipping, as you can see in the white dash line, to reduce their sector emissions as a part of the overall effort to decarbonize transport and specifically to decarbonize freight. Within the European Union, you can see the same data using the European Union's report to the UNFCCC. And what you see here is that that European freight sector, as reported by the EU, is about 2/3 of the European road vehicle sector. So that just gives you some context in the regional sense of things for discussion today. In order to get there, there needs to be a number of things happening. This isn't as easy as switching to a cleaner fuel as the industry successfully did in 2020. This will require a combination of tools that must work together: technology, energy, and behavior. Here's just a quick list for your skim. I won't go into these in the presentation, of technologies that may be useful, of the kinds of energies that are being talked about. And the important thing is all of those come at a different set of investment costs and operating costs. And so there will be some opportunities, signals for reacting to those price signals or responding with some planning. The regulation timeline, as it looks today, is a timeline that goes out off to the right to the 2030 and the 2050 targets. And you see represented here a variety of milestones. Mainly in the bottom, they're the international milestones where nations are working out the tough details for successful international and global decarbonization. And you see on the top the expected release in this quarter for the European Green Deal Fit for 55 package, which I'm sure we'll be talking about. That Fit for 55 package essentially is a well-rounded package in the sense that it is aimed at a variety of aspects that include the demand and use of lower carbon and zero carbon fuels, the kinds of pricing signals that are needed to help make sure that transition happens, the supply of energy that's necessary to achieve those goals. And then it also has legislative packages for financial and taxation reform. With regard to market-based measures, which is the MBM pricing part of the EU legislative package on a regional scale, market-based measures that may include carbon pricing, energy pricing, a variety of different signals like that. They work successfully where the market is global, the information is transparent and shared. And essentially shared information signals the market to react, and pathway options where they're available enable those choices, those reactions to be strategic. And the timing of the market-based measures is really important to help advance pathways as we find them. The last figure here is essentially another time series of the share of that essentially shows that about 20% of EU shipping, about 20% of world shipping is EU shipping, whether you count it by number of ships or here by the amount of carbon dioxide emitted. So just to finish up, we think that good policy and committed action are going to work jointly together. This is a joint and shared problem. It requires trial and success innovation. It requires investment in infrastructure. It will need those clear market signals. And that kind of good policy will help the sustainable fleet renewal. And with that, I'm very, very happy to stop these brief background remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jim. So now straight away over to Jacob. You've got the floor, and I'm sure there are going to be a number of questions coming in. So, and I do encourage anyone who's watching, and there are 3 figures of you out there, to send in your requests to @emlo.org, and we'll try and work them into some order and try and deal with them if we can. Jacob, over to you.
Perfect. Thanks very much. I should be sharing my screen now. Can I get a thumbs up just to confirm?
Yes.
Perfect. Thanks. Well, thanks very much to EMLO for the introduction. Thanks to Jim for the great first presentation. So I just want to take 15 minutes myself just to kind of try and give more of a little bit of an introduction to what's happening in the EU. So talk about, first of all, the challenge, what's the kind of most important part of that challenge, and then finishing off by introducing some of this Fit for 55 package, which we're looking forward to next week. So first of all, what is the challenge? Well, as has been said, EU shipping is a big polluter. In the EU, it accounts for about 3.5% of the EU's total emissions. And this is roughly equivalent to the entire emissions of Belgium. And I think what we have to see there is that a country like Belgium, or any country in the EU, has a huge range of measures, targets, standards for all of its sectors to reduce emissions. And unfortunately, at the EU, shipping doesn't have anything. It does at the IMO, but I think one thing that has to be said at the IMO targets is, unfortunately, they're not up to the European Green Deal standards. So the IMO has a target of 50% reduction by 2050, but in the EU we want 0 by 2050. And shipping at the moment, according to the IMO, emissions are actually going to increase. So here in this graph, you see the green line, which is emissions decrease needed to reach the Paris Agreement targets. And the red line is the agreement that was reached, and the grey line is business as usual. So unfortunately, the IMO, it's not going as quickly as we'd like. So the targets aren't consistent with the European Green Deal. So hence why we need to move forward in Europe. And I do think it's important, it's useful to take a step back and say why it's so urgent. Why is it so urgent that Europe moves forward? And very simply, if we look at what's happening in Canada, Siberia, record heat, temperatures, and then the effects on the Arctic, what we're seeing is that climate change is happening now. Someone's paying for it, but we need to make sure our policy is responding to the urgent need. So what does this mean in shipping then? Essentially, it's kind of simplifying ad absurdum. You get there's a couple of different things needed to get to 0, essentially. Here, if you can see in this graph, which I might come back to a couple of times, you see the blue, which is generally, with the blue and the yellow, let's say, are about using less fuel. So blue is about energy efficiency. It's about things like going slower. It's about wind propulsion, things like this, or just general energy efficiency measures. And it's about going the same distance, but with less amount of fuel. The yellow is port electrification. So there's quite a lot of emissions that we can reduce when ships are at berth by plugging in. But really, the biggest kind of work is going to be done by new fuels. So it says fuels is pretty much the challenge is getting fuels right. So action is very much urgently needed, and it's to do with those fuels. So let's go. So I think it's important to go into detail about those fuels because it's quite difficult to get fuels right, but it's very easy to get fuels wrong. So I want to look at the options. So first of all, we talk about a lot about transitional fuels, fossil LNG, which is natural gas. We also talk about biofuels, which I'm sure this will be clear for most of you, but biofuels are fuels produced from more organic feedstock. So often it's from crops, but this can also be from waste. And then finally, e-fuels, which are essentially, in the context of shipping, it's hydrogen that's produced from when you use electricity to split water into hydrogen and oxygen, and then you use this hydrogen as a fuel, or you add nitrogen to it, use it as ammonia, or you add carbon to it and use it as methanol. So those are kind of broad options. So going into a couple of those. First of all, LNG, so liquefied natural gas. We at Transport Environment are quite clear on this, that we see LNG as kind of a big danger at the moment, very simply. Reason being, this graph shows greenhouse gas emissions. So what you see in blue is carbon dioxide emissions. So as you can see, LNG is better than the conventional fuels when we look at carbon dioxide. But LNG is made up of a lot of methane. And methane, if you compare it to carbon dioxide, basically it absorbs more heat. So if you have a ton of methane in the atmosphere and a ton of carbon dioxide, the ton of methane is the more potent greenhouse gas. And so what the problem with LNG is that when you take it from the ground, when you transport it in a ship or in a pipe, and when you use it, importantly on a ship, some of this LNG comes out without burning. And this is called methane slip. So what we see is when you actually use methane, the climate impact is worse than conventional fuels because you have this extra methane coming out. So for us, this is quite an important point to note, that LNG, when we talk about LNG, the cure really is worse than the disease. Going to biofuels then. So as I said, biofuels are crops, and the first thing to mention about biofuels is they're quite inefficient. On the left, you can see how many cars would be fueled by a football pitch full of crops. That's 2.4. If you compare that to the 260 cars that would be fueled by a football pitch worth of solar panels, you really start to see the difference between, and especially electricity from renewable energy and biofuels. So it's quite inefficient, and this is important because it means you need a lot of it to supply certain sectors. And here in this graph, you see the projected sustainable biomethane supply, and then all the sectors which potentially will have a demand for it. And so this is quite important to see that there's not enough sustainable supply of biofuels. And this is also dangerous because, very simply, biofuels can lead to deforestation. It's by a thing called indirect land use change. And so what you see here is on the left, you have kind of scenario one, where you've got X amount of ground is used for food. And then, you'll come along and say, we're going to take a part of this for biofuels. And you say, sure. But of course, the food demand is still going to be the same. So you're going to need extra land elsewhere to plant that food. And so what happens then is that extra land needs to come from somewhere. And often this means deforestation. More than half of the imports to Europe at the moment for biofuels are from outside Europe. And so what this simply means is deforestation in areas like Southeast Asia and in Latin America. So essentially, this is why e-fuels are looking like the best option. We talk a lot at T&E about hydrogen and ammonia, simply because they're cheaper to make than, for example, LNG and diesel, which are actually they can be quite complicated to make synthetically. But so essentially the point is e-fuels, hydrogen-based e-fuels, are the cheapest option for sustainable maritime transport. So that's the fuels in a nutshell. So now moving to how can Europe, what are the tools on the EU's table to try and push the development, the deployment of those fuels and try and push shipping onto the decarbonisation path. So Jim's mentioned most of these, so I won't kind of introduce all of them. I'll just go into depth in two of them. So first of all, the emissions trading system. So this is pretty much, it's a very interesting kind of project, is a very interesting policy kind of instrument. It's essentially, if it's a cap and trade system where you say you cap the total amount of emissions possible. You convert these into allowances and you make polluters pay for the allowances, and they also give them the opportunity to trade. So if they pollute less than they need, then they can sell more allowances and vice versa. So essentially it creates a market and a price, importantly, for emissions. So moving to what a shipping ETS would mean, essentially not in terms of the economics of the industry, the likelihood is it wouldn't mean much because the cost would be passed on. Because essentially, when you talk about emissions trading system, it's going to rise the price, increase the price essentially related to fuels, because obviously emissions are directly related to fuels. So this, what we see in the shipping industry is that price fluctuations in the price of oil, they're often just passed on. In 2008, the price of oil was more than twice what it was today, but those costs were just passed on to the consumer. It's very possible that the ETS will incentivize some energy efficiency measures. Like I said, things like wind propulsion, which are very, very interesting. I think it is kind of stunning how we've come kind of full circle now in the shipping industry. We're looking back at sales and things like this, which will actually save the industry money because it's because you use less fuel. So essentially the ETS might incentivize some energy efficiency measures. But the point is, it's not going to lead to a fuel shift, at least in the near future, because the price of carbon in the ETS is not enough to make the, let's say, conventional dirty fuels competitive with the clean new fuels. So it begs the question, why apply the ETS to international and EU shipping? Very simple. Three simple reasons. One, so it internalizes the external cost of dirty fuels. So it basically means that the price of the dirty fuels is hopefully going to be reflective of its actual price on society. And so it's going to try and push the price of dirty fuels up to bridge that gap slightly with clean fuels. Secondly, revenue is going to be important, especially for climate adaptation and mitigation measures. But really, essentially, it's about the polluter pays principle, which is really at the heart of the European Green Deal. So Ursula von der Leyen has said, every ton of CO2 has to have its price. And this is exactly why shipping needs to pay. Every other sector has emissions reductions targets, contributes to reductions goals, as I said, and shipping really needs to do so as well. So that's ETS. So moving on to the Fuel EU Maritime Initiative, which is, in a word, this is the kind of initiative to put shipping on the path to decarbonisation. So what it is in kind of technical terms is it's a goal-based fuel greenhouse gas intensity target. So what does that mean? So it means essentially this is going to be applied per fleet. So if you are a shipping company, if you have a fleet, now all of your ships run on a conventional fuel. In 2025, there is a target which say the average carbon intensity has to drop 2%. So it means that the carbon coming out of all your fleet has to drop 2% by 2025. So what you could do, you'd have most of your fleet, almost all of your fleet on traditional fuels, and then you might have one or two on e-fuels, and that would bring your average down. And then 5 years after that, it's 6% less. You'd need slightly more cleaner fuels, and so on until 2050. So that's the kind of general idea. It's supposed to use a life cycle analysis where you look at all of the emissions across the fuels you use. So this is especially interesting in terms of biofuels, because the thing about biofuels, as I said, indirect land use change. If you're cutting down trees to make the biofuels, well, then you're actually limiting the kind of the ability to absorb carbon dioxide. So again, the environmental performance is worse. So this is important that something that these kind of concepts are considered in. And then a couple of things just to explain the initiative. As I said, there's going to be energy efficiency, try and push some of this energy efficiency measures needed. So there's going to be an additional bonus for wind propulsion technologies and mandatory use of shoreside electricity. So when ships come into port, they're going to have to plug in essentially, so they don't kind of use those fuels in the port. And so just to finish off, maybe I'm just going to say at the moment, there is a danger that Fuel EU Maritime actually leads to kind of incentivizing exactly what I talked about earlier, which was kind of the wrong fuels, which is LNG and biofuels. So we ran a couple of calculations based on a leak of that initiative. And basically it looks at the moment like the decarbonisation legislation would actually lead to about 44% of conventional fuels by 2035 in fleet average. About a third LNG, and about 20% biofuels. So as I said, this isn't necessarily going to this isn't going to put us on the path for decarbonisation. But anyway, that was potentially a little bit technical, but I just wanted to use that to give an introduction to what's happening at the EU, why what's happening in the EU is urgent, and why it's very important to get right now the kind of legislative framework for the clean fuels of the future. So yeah, as I said, I hope it wasn't too technical. Yeah, looking forward to any questions.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Jacob, and thank you to Jim. One of the questions that's occurred to me, and I'm now going to use my chairman's privilege, is how far is the technology there to implement some of these changes? I mean, how far are we crossing our fingers and hoping that something will come along within the time frame? I'm fascinated by the references to using electricity to generate hydrogen, which is then combined back with oxygen in the air to turn into water, which is, of course, a nice clean exhaust product. But how far are we able to scale up already some of these technologies for the very significant size, of course, that's needed in the shipping world? Jim, how are you in the sector seeing that?
Well, I think it's important let me just make sure I understand the question, is how far is the technology to do this? And then you talked a little bit directly about the e-fuels, the electrically generated fuels, yes, as the technology. It's important to recognize that there will be multiple pathways that will fit a diverse fleet, and that means that there will be a need for renewable, green, electrically derived synthetic fuels for an important part of the fleet, maybe a lot of the deep water fleet that needs a highly dense, energy intensive fuel that they can carry on board. Mm-hmm. There is the option for regional shipping, for ferries and hovercraft to look at electrification directly. And there is also a variety of end energies that are being looked at. Some of our members are looking at gaseous energies with flexible energy power systems. Others are looking at the biofuel pathways. So just to make sure that the technology question is plural. That's my first
technologies question. Yes.
Yes, and the important point is that the pathways are not well charted, but they are. But we are on our way. We are beginning the work of the necessary trial and success that is going to prove at scale which technologies fit which parts of an international transportation service to nations and to the communities that the ports receiving cargoes serve. We are committed and we're looking to get started. It's also really useful to point out that that the good background, the technical detail that Jacob described, outlines that in the near term, e-fuels are not yet quite on that map. And part of that is that the shipping industry is committed to preparing our fleets for decarbonize, for zero carbon, low carbon, green energy systems. And we need to meet the energy infrastructure as it rebuilds and transforms so that we are getting there. So one of my friends used to say there's two parts to every problem. There's the getting started and the getting finished. And I want to make it clear that we have gotten started. We are on our way. But I need to make it clear that that pathway is not at all clear, and a lot of research and development is needed. As Jacob said too, there's a lot of proving of which fuels will fit for which purposes left to do. And that work, as it becomes understood, needs the time that it needs to get there. And that's one of the reasons that the target milestones are set where they are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Jim, one point that, or one way of improving, if you like, the output that was identified by Jacob was running the ships more slowly. But of course, the corollary of that is if you have ships running more slowly, then you need more ships. How far, there's obviously on the bell curve an optimum point, which combines it before the ships are running so slowly that you're really losing out by having too many more ships.
Right, right. Well,
do you see that as being capable of producing a significant benefit? In
short, slow steaming, just prescribing a slower speed, is a reaction, not a response. And it delays some of the necessary efforts, if you think of it as a way of keeping the existing fleet longer and just making it move more slowly. An example of this, when right steaming happens, and right steaming is what the industry does, the liner industry especially has used right steaming over the last decade to reduce its average speeds by about 25%. Mm-hmm. Slowing down more doesn't reduce as much per slowdown. Mm-hmm. And it, like you say, gets in the way of the capacity of transport to move. As Mr. Power talked about at the beginning, the logistics issues with delays because of some of the COVID problems have really essentially taken capacity out of the fleet. Slowing down can take capacity out of the fleet. The solution is not about which speed to choose. It's about how a market signal can incentivize a variety of operational and technology changes at a signal strong enough to really pursue decarbonization, not just speed minimization.
Mm-hmm. And what about vessel size? Obviously, there are economies there, but are we just going to be constrained on doing anything more on that front by the inherent limits of the Suez Canal and other canals?
Well, I think the important thing to think about with vessel size is that the vessel size is a correlation to what you said about increasing fleet capacity. Mm-hmm. If there were speed reductions. If you need to move the same amount of goods and you're going to move them in less frequent arrivals, you either need larger or you need more vessels. How that works with the geography, with the constraints of port depths, with canals, et cetera, that's a familiar optimization problem that will be re-optimized as we bring in the market signals and we adopt the low carbon, zero carbon technologies.
Yes.
Nicholas, I am back online.
Yes,
if you can hear me.
Yes, we can. Do you want to come in here, Jacob?
Yeah, sorry, yes. So I hope, again, apologies for that. I have no idea what happened. So just, yeah, no, so I catch, of course, a little bit of what Jim was saying. I think, there's a couple of, in terms of the speed, I think we do see very interesting things happening, in particular with voyage optimization, and so trying to kind of reduce speeds going towards ports, and there's interesting things happening in ports there. But essentially, from our point of view, and from, I think there has been a lot of work done on in particular the issue of speed, which has shown that actually speed reductions would be incredibly beneficial in terms of emissions reductions. And there's a couple of things to note there. First of all, obviously, as Jim noted, this is something that's already happened, and so there is a question about, can it happen again? And I think what we've seen in COVID is particularly interesting in this regard. Because what we've seen is fuel prices went down, but there was essentially the demand kind of went out. Everyone was sitting at home, buying on IKEA. So you had actually ships going a lot faster because the fuel price was less important. So this is an example of where shipping is a very dynamic industry, and so demand supply can go up and down. And so speed reduction is an important thing to have in the future. And so, for example, we can talk about numbers, but CE Delft, a Dutch consultancy, ran the numbers, and they found that with, for example, a 10% reduction, you'd get, if you made the whole fleet reduce its speed by 10%, you'd get a 27% reduction in emissions. And then if you add the additional fleet needed to do the same transport work, you'd still get a 19% reduction in emissions. And so if you actually go further, 20%, you can still get more there. And I think I do like using the analogy here, is because we do have speed limits, for example, on the road, on trains as well. for safety, essentially. And I think that, if you think about it in those terms, if we look at climate change as a safety kind of problem, as an issue, then we need to look at doing something in terms of speed reduction on the seas.
Thank you. Now, we do have a number of questions coming in. The first one is, and I'll put it to both Jacob and Jim, and I don't know, please feel free, both of you, to come in on this one. We've been asked if you could give the audience some more information about, first of all, the scope of application of the EU exchange trading system for shipping and its implications for external, i.e. non-EU territories. And I think that the questioner would also, and I think many of the audience would like to know more about what procedures are now envisaged after we get the publication of the Fit for 55 paper in terms of EU ETS due in a few days' time. And anything about an entry into force date? Do we have any idea of what's going to be happening? There's a separate question about finance, but I'll come back to that. But would the two of you like to come back on what's going to happen after the 14th? What's expected in terms of response by industry, timetables, and of course the geographic scope of application, the famous extraterritorial questions, which we sometimes get in relation to competition cases, but obviously also have an implication in other areas too. I don't know which of you two want to go first. Jim, do you want to say
Sure.
what you're expecting?
Sure. I want to tease you for a minute, Sir Nicholas. The answer to your 4 questions is it depends. But what I'll do is I'll take maybe the first one on the potential scope for a regional ETS to achieve its regional goals and whether or not it can address some of the important international goals for decarbonizing of all shipping, which is, of course, the goal. We think that a regional effort can be a way of looking at some of the techniques, but the extraterritorial reach can be a barrier to achieving some of the international goals later. So with regard to that, the important scope of the suggested domains that we are understanding to come about would address somewhere around 10 to 12,000 unique vessels out of a fleet of 60,000 vessels that are not engaged in regional service with the European Union. And if the rules were perfectly effective, then you could see a delineation of a regional fleet achieving certain goals and another set of vessels outside, the 80% or so of the vessels outside of the EU not being well addressed. And we would suggest that that an international market-based mechanism is the only way to avoid the isolation or the leakage problems that are raised when you think about the regional ETS. Extending the regional ETS beyond an EEA, beyond the domain of Europe to international voyages doesn't seem to address the problem. It misses the mark for the objective because it adds very few new additional vessels into the pricing mechanism. And what we would like to see is a pricing mechanism apply to all vessel types in a way that is fair and even, so that the fleet decarbonization process signals are international, not just intra-EU.
Mm-hmm. Jacob, do you want to comment on that, and in particular the second and third parts of the question? What do you envisage in terms of procedure now? Once the paper comes out, what do you think the Commission is expecting?
So we are expecting. I think. Okay. So
you're getting a sort of garbled noise. At least you are for me. I don't know whether Jim is shaking his head. We're having difficulty with your microphone.
Is that better?
You're still very mixed, cut off. There's probably a technical term for it, but what it does mean is we can't hear you.
Is it better?
Okay. Okay, well, go ahead and take it slowly, and we'll listen.
Try to take it as slow as possible to make sense. And essentially, in terms of the second and third questions, what we assume is that the Commission will come out with it. We are seeing that the Commission will propose something which, on this question of scope, which is probably the most important political question, they will regulate some of the extra EU emissions, so some emissions from Europe, linking Europe between Europe and non-European voyages. This will be confirmed in Council and Parliament, and there will be a political battle there. I do think Jim and I might be on other sides of that, but then we're expecting entry into force in 2023. So in broad terms, it's that. Yeah. I mean, on the scope question, if I may quickly, I think Jim and I, we definitely have both this. We agree that the objective has to be reductions worldwide, but unfortunately, from our side, what we see is that the IMO is not moving quick enough. As I said, simply, it's not going to get us to the Paris Agreement. And the second thing is as well, we've been promised by the EU that they would regulate shipping if the IMO didn't since 2002. So for 20 years, the EU has been waiting for the IMO. So very much for us, the time has come. We can't wait any longer. And as I said, the planet can't really wait any longer. So essentially that in terms of scope. And there's no reason that, I mean, there's very, very little reason why us moving now and regulating some international shipping wouldn't, first of all, there's no reason it would have significant issues worldwide. It wouldn't delay the IMO any more than it's already been delayed. And secondly, there's no reasons places like China couldn't also do a similar thing, and then you'd have, for example, a tessellation of carbon pricing mechanisms.
Mm-hmm. Jim, yes, do you
want I'd like to help with that a little bit. I don't personally, I am not as pessimistic about whether the IMO has or has not found itself unable to do something. It's in the middle of doing things, and it's a very, very tough time. International policy making really needs a strong, strong group of nations, and it needs them to be engaged in the hard work of consensus building to get this to be more than a regional decarbonization. And the European Union has a really important role to continue to serve as a leader at IMO. It has a very large block of delegated nation delegates there. And engagement at IMO is more important when the negotiations become tough. And just like any of the negotiations that are done in the open by a consensus body, the apparent toughness of negotiating times is often the preceding signal to some breakthrough. Our industry and a number of nations have submitted a formal proposal to accelerate the discussion, to bring forward and earlier the discussion for market-based mechanisms at IMO. We also have a proposal to help set a mandatory industry-funded research and development plan that would be able to provide transparency global and not just for one region's shipping. So I think that there's a real opportunity there, and I think that that Jacob and I would agree that that opportunity can't be abandoned, and that regional leadership includes that element.
Thank you, Jim. Jacob, two members of the audience have asked essentially the same question, and it was about your figure of the 19% reduction of the benefits of slow steaming. And both of them ask one way or another, does that take account of the full life cycle analysis, i.e. the carbon cost of building the new extra ships? Would you like to come back on that?
Yeah, I mean, very briefly, yes. I point them to CE Delft's analysis on the measure, and I think essentially the conclusion was shipbuilding obviously is a big industry. It's a big part. It's a part of the process. But when you look at the carbon emissions from the shipbuilding compared to the carbon emissions over a ship's lifetime, and we're talking about 30 years of burning a lot of fuel per day, it's minimal, it's negligible. So it does take it into account, but it's negligible. So yeah.
Well, thank you for that. We also have a question from CLIA Europe, Paul Altena, who talks about, refers to societal pressure, but how do we ensure that proper process is followed, taking account in particular of the impacts on the smaller maritime and segments and regional requirements of regional services. So, I mean, how, in other words, how much can we be, must we insist on a one-size-fits-all solution?
Well, may I start with that?
Yeah, go ahead.
The word proper process had me going in a different direction than the end of the question, but with proper process, the need to have good accounting of the performance, the greenhouse gas performance of fuels and the technologies that match them, to understand how that works. That process is something that was forged through the nearly 15 or so years that Jacob describes the IMO having worked before its 2018 consensus commitment to the ambitional strategy, to the strategy to have emissions by 2050 and to reach zero carbon as soon as possible thereafter. That work included 4 greenhouse gas studies that looked at how do you do the math on understanding the performance of ships as you find them. And we've perfected that pretty well. The process for certifying fuels is improving and it needs more work. So in that sense, I was thinking about the proper process. In that regard, a lot of the work in the Renewable Energy Directive revisions and in the new Fuel-E Maritime can help with that sort of accounting and certification process. Now, the idea of trying to make sure that no ship is left behind, to make a perhaps poorly American joke reference, the idea that everybody has to apply the same exact response, the same pathway, one size fits all, one shoe fits everybody, that is not what our members think. That's not what I see when I look across the fleet of ships. Regional service, short sea service, harbor service, and deep sea service will need some different pathways. That's me. Is that me all of a sudden? I don't know. I didn't touch a thing. My hands have never left my fingers. But I think it's important to recognize that a good market-based mechanism will apply a common pricing mechanism in a way that might be felt more strongly frankly, on liner shipping in some respects. It might be felt more strongly on different vessel types. The important thing is that the signal be shared and transparent, that it be held in a common framework, and that it be as global as possible to avoid leakage and to avoid a fleet segregation, a fleet isolation of a green fleet and a brown fleet. We don't want 80% of the world to stay brown while 20% of the world greens. That doesn't serve decarbonization.
Getting to the end of this session. Can I ask the technical people to, gosh, we're getting a bit of an echo here. Let me just turn that off. could the technical people notice that I've logged on again, because I see that my main computer, the battery is getting a bit flat. So if they can connect me with my other one, that would be fine. Do either of the two of you like to make some closing remarks? Jim first, and then Jacob.
I appreciate that you've let me go first each time. Jacob, would you like to begin?
All right.
I can quickly I mean, basically, I think the main things to take away from this discussion is the urgency to take measures. For us, what we see, we're very, very proud and pleased with European ambition. And I think this is what you see in a huge number of things. It's what they call the Brussels effect nowadays. Is that regulations adopted in Brussels have effect all over the world. And what we see is that if we lead, if we're the front runner catalyst in Europe, building up, for example, clean fuels technology, clean fuels infrastructure, and also kind of working to make those economies of scale. So at the moment, we've got a situation where diesel fuels, conventional fuels have actually, benefited for a lot of their lives from government support, and so are incredibly, bountiful and commercially feasible now. We need to bring e-fuels down, and Europe will be a part of that. And so, when that happens, it will be about exporting it to the world. This is going to be a question of European leadership and European competition as well. And so in terms of the technology question, it's going to be Europe leading. But the most important thing is if we get decarbonisation, if we ramp up these decarbonised technologies, we're looking at a better world in 2050.
Jim?
Sure. To bridge directly, the European Union's Maritime package engages a comprehensive concept, from demand to pricing to supply to new fleet financing and turnover. And we look forward, the World Shipping Council looks forward to working towards good policy design that helps Europe lead toward the goal. And we believe that Europe has embraced the goal as international shipping decarbonization. With regard to the packages, I'm very excited to see what comes out. According to what's been described by those that have seen previews, there may be much to work out within the European Union's Green Deal for maritime before we declare that it's a model for replication internationally. But international decarbonization will be informed by good policy that's made at any level, and we hope to learn from any policies that maybe merit some revision when we turn to the international one. And most importantly, I just want to finish by saying that decarbonizing ships is an important challenge that our members are committed to achieving. And the challenge of decarbonization is not in its urgency, not whether we should get started, but how. And how we get started and how we get there is very, very important. That requires joint problem solving. And one of the reasons that we are engaged on multiple levels with regional policy in Europe, with policy in other parts of the world, and with the technology and innovation centers, that we think that this is a joint problem that will need trial and success, and it will need to transform. Lastly, we share the recognition that policymakers have made and that experts are making, that there will be more than one pathway, more than one best energy. There will be multiple configurations to serve a diverse fleet designed to deliver global trade to communities.
Jim, thank you very much. I'm just trying to make sure we get rid of this echo. Ooh.
You sound okay coming through it. We can ignore the echo, sir.
Good. Right. Well, thank you both very much. That was a tremendously interesting and informative session. We're now going to hand over to for a further discussion. You will have appreciated, those of you who are listening, that some of this is going to cost money. And when money is there, therefore, we need to think about how this is all going to be financed. We've already had, in fact, one question about whether the life is there going to be any fund allocated for shipping decarbonisation technology and development. But for this part of the discussion, I'm going to hand you over for a discussion between Anna Bredema, who is Senior Policy Advisor on European Affairs at the Cyprus Union of Ship Owners, and I may say a very enthusiastic and active contributing member to EMLO and on its council. And she will be interviewing Catherine Dobransky, who is the Finance Director of EXA, the European Community Ship Owners Association. And they're going to be talking in particular about the EU taxonomy for sustainable finance and its impact on green ship financing. So immediately with that, Anna, over to you. Look forward to hearing your discussion.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sir Nicholas, for your words of introduction concerning myself and Kathleen. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. The winds of change concerning the future environmental EU legislation to meet the goals of the European Green Deal have blown in the area of sustainable finance. On the 21st of April, with the final version published, the European Commission adopted the most recent piece of the horizontal legislative package on sustainable finance for climate change purposes. This covers inter alia the maritime transport sector. Whilst there has been a steady retreat of the biggest world banks from shipping, the sector is in search of alternative sources of financing. However, taxonomy will put in place a whole spate of technical requirements on shipping activities to qualify as green activities in order to attract banks and financiers. So this interview gives you a summary of challenges and opportunities that the shipping industry as a transitional industry is facing. Taxonomy comes from the ancient Greek word taxinomia, meaning the science of classification. The Greek mythology lends us also a simulation of taxonomy, putting shipping in the Procrustean bed in order to fit to the technical screening criteria. The role of Procrustes is played by European policymakers. Greek mythology had a myth for all eventualities, of course. Sadly, not all myths have a happy ending. Now, turning to Kathleen, who is here to guide us with her dual qualification in law and finance from her work and her studies, she is going to guide us through the legal maze of the taxonomy legislation. What is the main purpose of the taxonomy regulation regarding shipping, and what is the scope of operations of the Delegated Act of 1 concerning maritime activities? Kathleen.
Well, thank you very much, Anna, and good afternoon for all. I hope you hear me properly. First of all, super, thank you very much, Nicholas. First of all, as we already have seen very briefly in Jacob's slide, there was a mentioning about taxonomy as a potential tool of the sustainability agenda. And I would like a little bit go back in time in order to understand what exactly the taxonomy is about, in order to understand its initial aim and the scope of this legislative initiative. And I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I'm not going to be able to give you in this very short period to give you an answer how we are going to finance all these sustainability projects. But I'm hoping that at least we will clear up some clouds on what the taxonomy is about. So basically, if you recall, after signing the Paris Agreement, the Juncker Commission came up with a communication on sustainable finance. And there was an idea behind this communication. They basically figured out, or they thought that if in Europe there is only investors are only willing to put money into green and sustainable projects, then there will be no companies investing in other activities than green and sustainable activities. So this is where the whole idea of the sustainable finance package came from. And because it was addressing primarily the financial services industry, so bankers and investors, therefore, the entire initiative started to address the financial services industry, and therefore the entire discussion on the sustainable finance package was discussed between financial services experts. This has a bearing still on the process that is ongoing at the moment. When it comes to the new Green Deal objectives, which is set out from the von der Leyen Commission later, obviously they saw that there was already in place something on sustainable finance. So why shouldn't they use it, which they did, and they raised it to a higher priority politically, and its importance became really escalated, and the entire sustainable finance package became a horizontal file impacting a lot of other industrial initiatives. So what is the taxonomy in this package? Because I was mentioning sustainable finance package, but the taxonomy is only one piece of this legislative package, this legislative initiative. We need to remember that the taxonomy is a classification. This is something which gives a definition how to define which economic activities of certain companies or certain projects are considered to be green or sustainable. The eligible economic activities are listed by NAICE codes. This is the statistical reference system or classification system of the EU. And the economic activity for the maritime industry is asset-based. That means that basically everything that is defined for the maritime transport under the taxonomy, that is going to be vessel-based. We are focusing on the vessels. When it comes to the taxonomy definition, what counts as maritime economic activity under maritime transport, then there is a non-exhaustive list of different vessel types. So this means that this can be expanded in the future, and obviously vessel types which are not necessarily explicitly listed can be also understood under this classification system. Whether the eligible activities are taxonomy aligned or not, that they have to decide on based on three different factors. These three different factors are coming from the following. Number one is the substantial contribution to one or more environmental objectives. These environmental objectives are defined by the taxonomy regulation, which has been adopted and entered into force last year. Then this regulation gives the Commission and gave the Commission to some delegated mandates to provide a level 2 so-called delegated act regulation that will further define the details of the requirements set out in the taxonomy regulation. So next to the substantial contribution, also it is important that an economic activity can only be aligned to taxonomy after substantially contributing to one or more environmental objectives, if it doesn't do any significant harm to the rest of the environmental objectives, and if this economic activity complies with the minimum social and labor requirements. This is with reference to ILO and OECD conventions at the moment. Then the criteria is going to be fine-tuned and detailed by the technical screening criteria, which is defined by the delegated act that Anna mentioned, that it was published. The first set of delegated acts was mentioned on April 21st. Then how we see this taxonomy, this is important to understand what is the scope of the taxonomy. We kind of can analyze that the taxonomy has a direct and an indirect scope. First of all, regarding the scope, obviously it goes for the environmental sustainability, that it is addressing the financial services providers, financial services member state regulators, investment firms, and particularly large companies who, in reference to the taxonomy or based on the taxonomy definitions, will have to report on how big proportion of their portfolio is taxonomy compliant, or how big proportion of their economic activities are green, basically based on the taxonomy. In order to be able to define this proportion, the shipping companies will be required to provide this information too, even though if they are not falling under the direct scope. We have to also mention the so-called indirect scope, which is coming from a market pressure. Because if you imagine that you are a bank who needs to report on this proportion of what are the green economic activities, it will have to ask its clients, what is the green economic activities under your activities that I can report as taxonomy aligned. So they will have to report, they will have to ask the clients also to report these economic activities. And of course, there is no obligation for smaller and medium-sized companies at the moment to report on their taxonomy aligned activities. But due to the fact that investors in Europe are already very much driven by sustainability culture, by investing only in sustainable projects, and one of the tools the taxonomy can show them what is considered to be sustainable. Obviously, if we are not providing any information on that, we might see that we are not able to access certain sustainable financing. So this is basically the scope and the impact that we first see.
Katalin, after having heard this most enlightening expose, according to the current technical screening criteria, if the vessel transports fossil fuels, no matter how green the vessel is, it would not qualify as green investment. How do we handle this? Does this rule exclude the entire tanker fleet?
Well, I wish I could give you a very short answer for this. And obviously the answer is not always very positive. But what we need to understand that excluding fossil fuel in any format on any level is a political decision, which needs a little bit of further explanation. In principle, yes, the aim of the regulator was to penalize fossil fuels at any level. However, we must take into account the fact that we need to be in transition. The shipping industry is, by regulation, defined as a transitional sector. And this transition needs to address other market players who actually have an impact and who can have an impact, a direct impact on a certain given economic activity. This is not necessarily true for the transport part. So for example, from a ship owner's perspective, having penalized the cargo for which mainly the general market demand and supply is the main driver, it's very difficult to impact this factor. So transport will be needed for a certain time. We know that this is the transition. The question is, what is the most efficient way to do this transport? And if we penalize the most efficient way of transport, then we might see some negative repercussions. So this has been, of course, partly recognized at technical level, but the process, as I mentioned, is highly politicized. So we have to focus on what exactly is going to be the dedicated to transport of fossil fuel. This is the exact wording, dedicated to. We need to understand what will be the interpretation of this, how many vessels will be included and excluded. But for example, let's assume if a tanker, which would be defined as completely green based on its operation, and if in principle it can be also used for transporting other sustainable fuels, once the market demand and supply require, we question why should it be excluded from the taxonomy compliance and taxonomy alignment.
Now, in light of concerns expressed as to the implications of maritime taxonomy, what are, in your view, the implications at international level? Isn't it a dangerous path for the EU to devise unilaterally the taxonomy standards? Are the Chinese, Japanese, and other competitors of the EU fleet subject to the same requirements? Do you see other jurisdictions following the EU policymakers, for instance, Asians or Americans?
Indeed, again, a very interesting question. And of course, because shipping industry is has a global nature, we have some concerns here. Due to the negative consequences of regulatory fragmentation, which we all know what could be, a regional legislation should obviously be avoided as much as possible, especially for a global industry like shipping. The EU, through international cooperation, should devise the criteria to safeguard an international level playing field. And in our view, the EU regulators are following this path in the field of sustainable finance on different levels. So there are different initiatives from the EU regulator to kind of like see how we can move into a global field. For example, the EU co-chairs with China the International Platform of Sustainable Finance. So this is an initiative which is quite remarkable. But if we want to mention also other levels on sustainable finance level, I mean, the central banks of different European member states are also running a network on sustainable finance. What we need to mention here that, of course, some other jurisdictions like the US has expressed its concerns about the EU taxonomy. However, more and more jurisdictions are looking at very similar solutions as the EU taxonomy. All agree that there is a tool needed for classification on what is a green economic activity. And there are certain initiatives from Chile, from Japan, but of course, a lot is depending on how everything will be put in use, what are going to be the differences of these frameworks, and of course, everything is in the making. So it's very difficult to answer this question, how much the negative and the positive side of these developments we will see.
Now, as a follow-up to this question, since world shipping demands a global level playing field, is EU taxonomy in line with IMO, or does it go beyond it?
I think all of us know that for the shipping industry, this is one of the major concerns, and we already have heard it from our previous colleagues mentioning this briefly. We also heard that the EU has the ambition to lead the sustainability agenda at a global level. On the one hand, this is some kind of a political competition factor as well. But at the same time, we need to highlight that the EU is willing to provide resources to reach the sustainability goal at a global level. So the EU regulators, as we already have heard, do believe that the IMO is too slow to ensure that the EU Green Deal is in the right track. So unfortunately, I have to say that, yes, we can expect that the taxonomy will go beyond the IMO.
And now let us turn to the diversity of shipping. The taxonomy definitions regarding eligible maritime activities should take into account the following characteristics: the diversity of these activities. We have liner, tramp shipping, deep sea, short sea, offshore, the diversity of ship sizes and ship types, and diversity of business models, existing ships and new ships. What guidance would you give to policymakers to take into account these characteristics?
Well, Anna, I think you touched upon one of the major concerns, diversity of the shipping industry. We all know that a one-size-fits-all approach is not always suitable, and especially not suitable for the maritime sector. The deep knowledge of the diverse characteristics of the shipping industry is really essential to establish the usable and efficient definitions for sustainable maritime economic activities. So basically the taxonomy classification for maritime transport. Also, this is very important for the sake of the investors, because if they don't have the right information and not the usable information, then the whole purpose of the taxonomy is not going to work out. So developing and aligning the taxonomy to its purpose requires a knowledge in three different settings. Number one, we need to have a proper knowledge of the entire supply chain. This is number 1 point. Number two, we need really deep insights and deep technical details on technical knowledge on the unique characteristics of the shipping industry, or the different diverse characteristics of the shipping industry. And third, we need also people and knowledgeable experts how to link all these into one big package, basically having the interdisciplinary approach. So the Sustainable Finance Platform, which hasn't yet so far been mentioned, but they are the ones who are tasked to establish and review these definitions under the taxonomy. And honestly, it would be really highly beneficial for both the regulator, the EU economy, and also for the investor base to include experts following these lines, whether it's the shipping industry or others, but certainly following the supply chain approach, the technical expertise on the certain knowledge of different characteristics, and the interdisciplinary linkage.
The lack of common definitions to identify which types of investment can be identified as green may lead to transitional technologies like the LNG that was discussed in the session before, like the LNG without accounting to the methane slip. What is your view about the greenwashing challenges?
Yes, this is a very, again, a very difficult question. And why I'm saying this, because I personally believe that greenwashing and transitions are two different matters. At least under the taxonomy, I think they are certainly overlapping and linked, but they need a different approach and different type of solutions. As we mentioned, it is key that the shipping industry is recognized as a transitional industry. And this requires that the industry needs in-between steps to reach the green goals. The EU shipping industry is dedicated to do so. In order to climb the in-between steps of the ladder, we need the technology neutrality. But of course, the taxonomy is not supposed to pick out one or another different technology or fuel type and so on. It has to provide some kind of an in-between steps to reach the final goals when it's for transition, and for the end result, obviously, what is going to be counted as green.
Well, I have here one more challenge for you, Kathleen. Is taxonomy going to drive to more consolidation in the market? Does taxonomy mean that the small and medium-sized enterprises will be driven out of the market?
Well, there is a risk for that, simply because what we see at the moment, that SMEs might face some difficulties. It is relatively more burdensome for SMEs in its current format, even to comply with the taxonomy, even though I have to highlight that the requirements of the taxonomy regulation or even the reporting requirements based on the taxonomy definitions are not obligatory for SMEs in legal terms. But what I already mentioned regarding the indirect scope, if they are not taxonomy compliant or not taxonomy aligned, also by choosing not to report because economically they cannot afford it, they may face difficulties in accessing sustainable financing. And the regulator is dedicated to protect SMEs. There is no question about that. They are considering possible tools how to ensure that the SMEs are not overburdened. And there are certain solutions for that which are under discussion. For example, how to create certain reporting standards. But the taxonomy can provide this feature in the future. But at the moment, as I mentioned, it's still in the making and we are not there yet. So again, there is no easy answer for your question on that one.
And my last question, what does your crystal ball say? Is taxonomy reducing finance opportunities in the EU? Does taxonomy simplify or complicate ship owners' lives?
I wish I had a crystal ball, Anna. I think that would make our lives much simpler, but unfortunately I don't. There are, of course, opportunities and challenges in this initiative. The taxonomy itself is a tool to measure what activities are green to help the financial services to decide whether their portfolio they invest in is in green or not. In principle, it should not complicate the lives of ship owners. It should not be the carrot. It should be the carrot. It shouldn't be the stick. In practice, we see, however, some negative trends, which is a result of many factors. One of them is the complexity of this initiative, the scope, the hybrid and the dynamic nature of this regulation, and of course, amongst others, the process that we are following. We also need to remember that what the taxonomy is there for. Defining the top performing green activities, that was its initial purpose. It raises, however, the question, how do we address the transition? So this is the challenge of the same time. And if I put now my economist hat on here, then we need to consider this from a little bit of a cost benefit analysis angle and say, we need to have a cost benefit analysis then to ask the question whether it is worth it and whether it is going to be more complicated or simplify my life regarding all the advantages. And then if I take off my economist hat and put on my my proactive hat here, then I say the taxonomy is very complex, but it is a new dictionary. It is a new dictionary for a newly developing language, which will stay with us for the next couple of years, even decades. That's the sustainability language. It has its hybrid character, which makes it even more complicated to follow and understand for the time being. But if the language is calibrated properly, and if it's usable and it stays alive, we will learn it, and then we will be able to use it even if it is complex. But then it requires that it is properly done, and then it's done efficiently.
Ladies and gentlemen, what are our main messages from this session? Our basic takeaway for you from this webinar, addressed primarily to distinguished lawyers, is that maritime taxonomy is here to stay. It is a highly complicated and ongoing exercise. Uncertainty is the bottom line. Uncertainty for ship owners, financiers, and charterers. Uncertainty about the regulatory developments, uncertainty about the technological developments. The only certainty will be the trend for green financing. So it is important that ship owners have a communication channel. Collective effort will be required by all stakeholders involved: ship owners, investors, bankers, charterers, ports, classification societies, shipbuilders, marine equipment manufacturers. Compliance, as well as participation in the future policy making, requires an interdisciplinary approach involving lawyers, economists, and technical advisors in order to optimize the expert advice to clients. Shipping is a transitional industry, and taxonomy has some challenges, but if we get it right, it can be a helpful tool. Let us jump on the boat and make it work. The webinar has only scratched the surface of taxonomy and gave you just a glimpse of developments. Many more webinars will be required to answer the questions. So this gives you some food for thought today. I hope that you have all been alerted to the challenges of maritime taxonomy. And I would like to thank Katalin for her most interesting presentation. And we would like to thank EMLO for giving us the opportunity to participate in this webinar. And thank you all for your participation in this as an audience.
Well, I think it's now for me to thank the two of you for really a most stimulating discussion. Katalin, you in particular responded so well to Anna's questions. I think we're all much, much better informed. So thank you very much for that. As Dr. Anna Brademer mentioned, in responding to the situations that we've been discussing today, there is going to have to be a lot of cooperative work throughout the industry, between individual companies, within the framework of associations and so on. And that leads me, therefore, into tomorrow's session, which I hope many of you will join, because one of the great things about competition law is that sometimes it throws up problems, though it also provides solutions in relation to how industry and companies within an industry respond to challenges of this type. And tomorrow we are going to have a stimulating discussion from practitioners and indeed from the Dutch Competition Authority as to how the competition law is going to look at some of these, the sorts of discussion that are going to have to take place. So having given you all in the audience a taste of what I hope is what is to come, all I can do is thank today's contributors, all four of them, for their excellent contributions, and invite you in the audience to join us tomorrow